So if you wouldn't have sat next to me a year ago, and you've sat and researched now,
right?
Now what's your view?
On
me?
You seem like a cool guy.
Cheers.
You all right?
So you understand the level. Well, I met a father from Blackpool. The gang took his daughter. Okay, the father and the son would ring his phone, and he'd have to listen whilst they were ringing his daughter. Yeah? These levels, so you understand. And in 2015, so we go across the country, and I've done a presentation, Britain, as well as documentaries, and I go back to us marching through Telford. And now the arrest rates for these crimes, if you do a graph, it goes like this: there's none. Yeah, the English Defence League forms in 2009. By 2010 and 2011, the arrests are going through the roof.
The best thing for me that came out of the Donald Trump election was fake news. The term fake news. Because it makes everyone question everything they've been told. And I have so many people saying, oh, bruv, I hated you. I absolutely, we met a gentleman the other day, said, I hated you. You wouldn't be standing there with me here, because I'll be killing you. He goes, and then I've just then I've watched this, I've learned this, I've listened to you, and I've realised, geez, man. And then, but for me, that's good, because for me, it's because for me, the more people that question the media, the more people that question the narrative, the more people that start seeing the reality.
My sense was, and this is part of why you're here today, like I've been watching that since then. I don't know if it's since then, but it wasn't long after that. And it was my sense at the time, and this is something I think that Tammy has observed too, that your work was essentially what called attention to the fact of these grooming gangs.
So Andrew Norfolk is the Times newspaper who finally questioned these gangs. Now, what he says, we saw the emergence of the far right. He's given an interview. I had been made knowledgeable of these gangs for years, but everyone was too scared to touch it because all the men were Pakistani Muslim and all the girls were young English children. Yeah. So he'd known about it. So for me, Andrew Norfolk, yeah, okay, you ended up reporting it in the end, but you was a coward for years. Yeah.
Well, I also think, it's hard for people. What do they say? Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I talked to Michael Schellenberger about the trans butchery of kids that's going on now, WPATH. And Schellenberger, who's a very brave journalist, told me that he had listened to my interview with either Abigail Schreier or Helen Joyce detailing this out probably 2 years ago now. And he said he couldn't believe it. It took Schellenberger 2 years to contemplate this because he couldn't believe the magnitude of the crime. And I think it's not merely cowardice, although there's plenty of that. It's also the fact that, look, it's a lot easier to write you off than to admit that there are gangs of people who've been brought into the country who have set out malevolently and with intent to rape thousands of girls. So it's a hell of a lot easier to write you off as a far-right extremist than it is to even begin to contemplate what that might mean.
If they accepted from the start that we had this organisation called the English Defence League that welcomed blacks, that welcomed gays, that welcomed Jews, that welcomed Hindus, that welcomed everyone, and the problem was this radical sect of Islam, yeah? If they'd said, then they don't want the public flock into it. Right. So what can they do to stop it? Right. Far right, racist, Nazi, infiltrate. Everything they can do, which is and I mean like the lengths they went to, the lengths of secretive units. For a secretive unit within the Scotland Yard, one of my demonstrations when I was leading the English Defence League cost the police £2 million. Yeah? Now they want rid of me. That's what I knew that when I started looking at the figures. I thought, oh my.
That's the question I've got for you though. What is it with the police and you? I don't get it. Like, why don't it doesn't seem like, for me, from what I've seen, the police like you. Why don't the police like you?
If you go back to our videos, we're marching through cities saying Muslim pedos off our streets, yeah? Before all this. Now,
typical far-right stance.
Yeah, 2015 is when the Rotherham report was released, okay? Now, this is when Andrew Norfolk started talking about it. Now, so Andrew Norfolk starts talking about it, then they do an investigation in the city of Rotherham, and the city of Rotherham has a 3.7% Muslim population, and they find that over 1,400 children have been raped, yeah? And they find that the police knew, social services knew, the government. Right. So I remember at the time of this, when it blew up, everything we'd said, everything we'd been screaming about, yeah? Now it's in a government report. Now
that was actually one of the things that really alerted me to just exactly how screwy things had become. So that was before I made the videos that made me viral in 2016. But one of the things I'd been following was that story. Okay. And it took me, the way you react when you come across a story like that is it's something like, there's just no way this can possibly be true.
And it's far worse than you can ever.
Yeah, well,
It's far worse.
They told me they couldn't do anything to keep me safe.
They treated us like child prostitutes and troubled children.
I was told repeatedly by the police that I was responsible for my own actions.
I will never forget the officer for as long as I live.
I've never trusted the police since.
The words of Rotherham abuse survivors, the most powerful part of a report which found South Yorkshire police missed opportunities to protect them and didn't recognise them as victims.
I would say it's pretty terrible. We've seen evidence of a force who officers on the ground were not treating children as children.
265 complaints, 47 officers investigated, but some had either retired or were given new training. One got a final written warning. Nobody was sacked. One of the many examples in this report, a 15-year-old girl who said she was raped in a park. Her father claimed a police officer told him that it might teach her a lesson about who she hangs around with. From the police in South Yorkshire today, an apology and a pledge that things are better now.
The level of abuse was harrowing. 1,400 people abused is an awful figure. But my response is one young person being abused in that way is also an awful figure. And for the police today, for South Yorkshire Police today, and all our partners, we are fully focused in identifying vulnerability at its earliest possible stage.
I know all these girls and families now, but you're not allowed to use their hidden. So this girl, one girl, her father had rang 999, the emergency number. When they went through to get the history of how many times he'd rung the emergency services for his daughter, it was 200 times.
Oh dear.
200 times he'd rang for help. 200 times. Then two fathers got together, and this is all in the report. It's not Tommy Robinson saying this. Two fathers got together, and their two 13-year-old girls were in a house being raped by gangs of Muslim adults. Yeah. The two fathers went round to get their daughters back. The police turned up and arrested the fathers. They left the girls in the house.
Now, what the police felt at the start, which they've openly told me as well, was that my ability to bring people together and walk through towns could provoke Bradford riots. Right. Not just in Bradford.
Just you being there?
Just us walking. Like, for example, loads of Muslims come out and one of them smashed a police officer with a brick. Police arrested him. 200 Muslims went to the police station with an imam and said, release him now. Now, I've read all this on left-wing sites, and I've read that they released him. And then I've gone and had for a meeting with the heads of Birmingham Police before a demo. I've said, can I ask you something about this? And I went through the case. I said, and I read he was released. And they went, yeah, he was. I went, what? What do you mean you released him? He smashed a cop with a brick. He goes, look, one man's arrest and one man's conviction, or the whole city burns. Right, okay. And it doesn't just burn here, it burns in Bradford, it burns in Oldham. So it's like, so you're giving in to mob rule, and since they burned the whole city and cost 20 or 30 million pound of damage and all of the problems across the country, since that you've given concession after concession after concession after concession because you're terrified of what they're going to do.
There's another incident in this report. 5 Muslim men have a 12-year-old English girl. They've got her drunk. She's in a derelict house. They're all raping her, yeah? The police turned up. They arrested the 12-year-old girl for being drunk and disorderly. Yeah? This is the level of one girl. She was 12 years old as well. They got a hot iron rod with the letter M and they heated it up and they scolded her bum because she was the property of Muhammad. Yeah? She was the property of Muhammad. Another girl they got and they nailed her tongue to a table. They used to take these girls out. We're not talking about sexual gratification here. Yeah? We're talking about total destruction of the most precious thing that we have, which is our daughters. Mm-hmm. Yeah? This is totally something. And when you go through the cases, I've investigated so many of them and looked through the numbers. Yeah, Rotherham had a 3.7% Muslim population. So for people to understand the scale of this problem, okay, there was 1,400 girls raped. I then looked and
how many men do you think were involved?
Well, this is so Telford.
Yeah.
So in Telford, I'd done an investigation into Telford, and the reason I chose Telford was one of the gangs where we'd had the report. The police had identified 1,000 victims and they'd identified 200 perpetrators. So I went and spent 18 months in Telford, and I got to know the story like you've seen, yeah? Mm-hmm. I've done a 5-part series called The Rape of Britain. And when I went there, we went there and worked for a year before we let out that we were working there. We got to know the girls. We got to know their families. I spent time interviewing. We had the ones that were willing to go on camera and the ones that weren't. So I got a database, and we built a database of names. So I'd interview a girl for 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, 3-4 times, hear every bit of her story, but then sit down and work through it. Now, when we got the men's names, we had 254 identified, yeah? And when they're identified by more than 3 girls who do not know each other, that's the green flag for me to go for them in the documentaries. I'm going to now make you famous, yeah? And now, the police investigation identified 200 perpetrators. Our investigation identified 254. An independent inquiry has identified over 300. Now, there's only a 1.7% Muslim population in that town. So how many Muslims is that? It's about 3 to 3,500. So when you get rid of the women and you get rid of the under 16s, yeah, we were talking about 1,000 men. Yeah? 1,000 Muslim men are in that town, and the police identified 200 of them. Now, when they brought them to prosecution, they prosecuted 11. Why? They only prosecuted 11. So when people see these headlines and you're seeing grooming, yeah, they're not doing them. They're doing a little, in each town, they're nicking a few, yeah? They're nicking a few. Now, what we found in our investigation was that one of the most senior ranking officers was receiving funds and monies from the gangs. The gangs act as a mafia. They're a Pakistani mafia, yeah? Their level of violence, the groups that they're linked with, they're all the way to the top, from solicitors to CPS lawyers to politicians. So in this one town where we'd done this big investigation, and we tried to give the information to the police, they wouldn't take it.